When I was 15 years old, my entire family packed up and moved 2 states away in the middle of the night without telling me. I woke up to an empty house, the electricity cut off, and a single sticky note on the kitchen counter that simply read, "You will figure it out." 12 years later, after I dragged myself out of that nightmare and built a financial empire from nothing, they had the nerve to kick down my office doors. They did not come to apologize. They came because they wanted to steal the very life raft I built. Before I share exactly how I made them regret the day they walked back into my life, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe that the best revenge is massive success. My name is Kiara. I am 27 years old and the founder and chief executive officer of Vanguard Horizon, a premier venture capital firm based in the heart of Atlanta. It was a Tuesday morning, crisp and perfectly routine. I was sitting at the head of my custom glass conference table, going over the quarterly projections for my investors. The room was a sanctuary of success with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city skyline. It was silent save for the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of downtown traffic 20 stories below. Then the heavy oak doors of my private boardroom did not just open. They were shoved apart with a violent force that made my executive assistant drop her digital tablet to the floor in pure shock. I slowly looked up from my financial reports. Walking through those doors was the living ghost of my past. My mother Vivian marched in first, her designer heels clicking aggressively against the polished hardwood floor. She was wearing her signature pearls and a sharply tailored suit, looking exactly like the wealthy buckhead matriarch she always pretended to be to her high society friends. Behind her was my father Marcus, his posture rigid, projecting an unearned authority. He surveyed my corner office, running his hand along the expensive leather of the guest chairs, nodding approvingly, as if evaluating his own property. He had not contributed a single dime to my survival, let alone my business, but his eyes gleamed with the unmistakable look of a man ready to collect his unearned dividends. Then came my older sister Jasmine, the undisputed golden child, and former sorority queen, clutching a luxury handbag like a shield of status. Finally, trailing behind them with an arrogant smirk, was Bryce, Jasmine's white husband, a tech bro whose mediocre startup I had read about in passing industry newsletters. 12 years. 4,380 days since they left me in that dark, freezing house. For a brief, foolish fraction of a second, a tiny part of me wondered if they had spent a decade searching for me. But one look at their faces killed that thought instantly. There were no tears in their eyes. There was no hesitation, no guilt, no desperate rush to hug the daughter they had abandoned to the foster system. Instead, Vivian marched straight to my end of the long table, bypassing the guest chairs entirely. She did not say hello. She did not ask how I was doing or how I had survived. She slammed a thick, glossy project folder down onto the glass right over my confidential quarterly projections. The sheer audacity of her movement sent a shockwave of cold adrenaline through my veins, but my face remained an unreadable mask. "Sign the approval for a $3 million funding round for Bryce's startup," my mother demanded. Her voice carried the same sharp, commanding tone she used when ordering me to clean Jasmine's room a lifetime ago. "Do it today, Kiara. I already informed your board of directors that the family is personally guaranteeing the investment, so there should be no holdup." I stared at the folder, and then at the steaming cup of artisan coffee resting near my hand. A memory flashed uninvited into my mind. The hollow, gnawing ache in my stomach when I was 15, searching through empty kitchen cabinets for a stray box of cereal, drinking warm water from an outside garden hose because the utilities had been shut off for unpaid bills. I looked at Vivian's perfectly manicured hands, adorned with diamond rings, and marveled at the absolute delusion standing before me. She was treating my multi-million-dollar company, a firm I built through sleepless nights, sheer grit, and ruthless determination, as if it were a family piggy bank she had every right to smash open. "You told my board of directors that the family is guaranteeing this investment," I repeated softly. My voice was dangerously flat. I did not yell. I did not cry. The 15-year-old girl who cried herself to sleep on a bare mattress was dead and buried. Of course I did, Vivian snapped, crossing her arms and glaring down at me as if I were a disobedient child. We are family, Kiara. Vanguard Horizon carries our legacy. It is only right that we keep the wealth within the circle. Family helps family. Family keeps the wealth within the circle. Family. The word tasted like ash in my mouth. Family does not leave a 15-year-old girl in a house with no electricity. Family does not pack moving boxes in the dead of night. Family does not leave a yellow sticky note as a goodbye. You have done well for yourself, girl, my father. Marcus stated, his voice booming in the quiet room, interrupting my thoughts. It is about time you started giving back to the people who gave you life. Do not be selfish now. Your legacy, I said quietly, keeping my posture completely relaxed. You have not spoken a single word to me in over a decade, Vivian. You do not get to walk into my building, interrupt my morning, and demand $3 million as if you are ordering a cup of coffee. Jasmine scoffed loudly from the back of the room, tossing her perfectly styled hair over her shoulder. Oh, please do not start with the dramatic victim act, Kiara, she groaned, rolling her eyes. We are here doing business. My husband is offering you a golden opportunity to invest in the next big thing, and you are acting like a bitter teenager. Be professional for once in your life, and recognize a lucrative deal when it is handed to you. I listened to them speak, absorbing every layer of their audacity. They had meticulously tracked me down, found my corporate headquarters, bypassed the front desk, security likely by throwing a temper tantrum, and stormed in here fully expecting me to write a blank check. They did not see a chief executive officer sitting before them. They saw the same vulnerable scapegoat they had discarded, assuming I was still desperate for their approval. They thought throwing the word family around would trigger some deep-seated need for validation. They were horribly, violently wrong. Without breaking eye contact with my sister, I slowly reached across my desk and pressed the silver security button discreetly built into the console under my hand. Seeing my hand move, Bryce decided it was his turn to take control. He adjusted the collar of his overpriced vest, a staple uniform for men who talked a big game but delivered absolutely nothing. My algorithm is going to disrupt the entire supply chain industry, he boasted, waving his hand dismissively. All I need is a modest seed injection of $3 million to scale the user base. Any intelligent investor would jump at this. I am actually doing you a huge favor by keeping this in the family before I take it to the major players in Silicon Valley. He stepped forward, bypassing my father, and leaned his weight heavily onto my glass table, invading my personal space. He flashed a condescending smile, the kind of smile a profoundly mediocre man uses when he mistakenly thinks he can charm a woman into submission. He looked down at me, completely unaware of the massive fire he was playing with. Come on, Kiara, Bryce said, his tone dripping with patronizing arrogance. Let us not be stubborn and childish about this. I know venture capital can be intimidating for young women, but my platform is a guaranteed unicorn. Just sign the approval sheet so we can get the funds moving into my account today. Family helps family, right? As for the legal paperwork, the underwriting, and the board compliance issues, do not worry your pretty head about it. You will figure it out. The room went dead silent. You will figure it out. The exact words from the sticky note they left behind 12 years ago. You will figure it out. The phrase echoed in my mind, not as a source of pain, but as the very weapon I was about to use to destroy them. The room went entirely still. The air conditioning hummed, but all I could hear was the rushing of my own blood. You will figure it out. He said it with such casual disregard, completely oblivious to the weight of those 5 syllables. The walls of my office seemed to stretch and warp, rushing away from me, while the glass table zoomed sharply into focus. For a singular blinding second, I was back in that empty, freezing kitchen, clutching a piece of yellow paper with my stomach twisting in hunger. I could almost feel the cold draft of that abandoned house. But the panic did not last. It instantly calcified into something freezing and lethal. Bryce took my silence for submission. He stood up straight, running a hand through his hair, and started pacing the length of my boardroom as if he held the lease to the building. Let me break this down for you in simple terms, Kiara, he said, his voice dripping with that unearned Silicon Valley confidence. When you are looking at Series A funding, you have to look past the initial cash burn rate and focus on the aggressive market penetration. My user acquisition cost is practically zero. It is a textbook hockey stick growth trajectory. I know you usually deal with smaller localized portfolios, but this is global scaling. You need vision to understand a tech ecosystem. He actually used his fingers to draw a hypothetical graph in the air. I sat completely still, staring at a profoundly mediocre white man standing in the empire I built from the ground up, attempting to teach me the basic definition of venture capital. The sheer privilege radiating from him was almost suffocating. Jasmine leaned forward, crossing her legs and flashing her perfectly veneered smile. "You really need to stop being so selfish, Kiara," she chimed in her tone, coated in toxic sweetness. "Bryce is handing you a golden opportunity on a silver platter. You should be thanking him. Do you know how many investors are begging for a piece of this? With my network and the connections I have cultivated through the historically black colleges and the Sorority Alumni Association, we already have the market cornered. We are throwing you a bone because Mom and Dad insisted on including you in our success. Do not let your petty childhood grievances ruin a massive payout for all of us." I looked at Jasmine, then at Bryce, and finally at the silver security button resting under my fingertips. I slowly lifted my hand away from it. I did not need security to escort them out. I needed them to stay right here and choke on their own hubris. I reached out and picked up my tablet. I typed in my passcode, the sharp taps echoing in the quiet room. I swiped the screen, transferring a highly classified digital dossier directly to the large presentation monitor mounted on the wall behind them. "Brother-in-law," I said, my voice smooth and dangerously polite. "You call this a golden opportunity. Let us look at the actual facts." The screen illuminated with stark black text and red warning flags. I read the highlights aloud, making sure my enunciation was perfectly clear. "Your so-called revolutionary supply chain algorithm is currently the subject of a massive class action lawsuit filed in the state of California. You are being sued for illegally mining and selling user data to third-party advertising agencies. Your chief technology officer resigned 3 weeks ago, citing gross mismanagement. Your burn rate is catastrophic, and your runway ends in exactly 14 days. You did not come here to offer me a lucrative deal. You came here begging for a lifeline because every legitimate financial firm in Silicon Valley laughed you out of their lobby." Bryce stopped pacing. The arrogant smirk vanished from his face, replaced by a chalky, panicked pallor. He stared at the screen, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly as he tried to formulate a defense that simply did not exist. Jasmine shifted in her seat, her manicured fingers gripping her designer bag so tightly her knuckles turned white. The illusion of her perfect, wealthy marriage was cracking wide open right in front of her. But I was not finished. I turned my cold gaze to Vivian and Marcus, who were suddenly looking very uncomfortable in their luxury-tailored suits. "And as for this generous family guarantee," I continued, swiping to the next slide on the monitor. "Tell me, Mother, exactly what leverage you plan to use to back a $3 million venture." The screen shifted to display a scanned legal document stamped with the official seal of a federal bank, because according to the foreclosure notices currently attached to your Maryland estate, you do not even own the chairs you are sitting on. Your credit is entirely maxed out. Your exclusive social club memberships have been suspended for non-payment. You are completely and utterly broke." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. I sat back in my executive chair, interlacing my fingers, watching the untouchable facade of the black elite crumble into dust right in front of me. Vivian looked like she was going to be physically sick. She avoided my eyes, staring a hole into the glass table, unable to process how quickly her lies had been dismantled. The elegant matriarch role she had played for decades was gone, leaving behind a desperate woman with empty pockets. Then Marcus slammed his heavy fists onto the table, causing the coffee cups to rattle violently. The veins in his neck bulged as he leaned over, towering above me with a look of pure, unadulterated fury. "How dare you investigate your own parents?" he roared, his voice shaking the glass panes of my office. "You think sitting in a fancy chair gives you the right to disrespect the people who put you on this earth? You think you built this all by yourself? You listen to me, you arrogant little brat. Do not forget for 1 second that this entire investment fund was founded on the reputation and the legacy of this family name." I did not flinch when his fist hit the glass. I simply pressed my finger down on the silver button under my desk and held it there. Within 10 seconds, the heavy oak doors swung open again, and two of my private security guards stepped into the room. I looked my father dead in the eye. "You have exactly 30 seconds to vacate my building before I have you arrested for trespassing," I said. My voice was dangerously calm. "And for the record, Marcus, the only thing your name ever gave me was a masterclass in betrayal. Take your bankrupt wife, your crying daughter, and your mediocre son-in-law and get out." They left, but they did not go quietly. If there is one thing a narcissist knows how to do when they lose control of a victim, it is to control how other people see that victim. Vivian activated her network before her luxury sport utility vehicle even pulled out of my parking garage. The black elite circle in Atlanta might reside in a sprawling metropolis, but its social dynamics operate like a tiny high school. Vivian had spent decades cultivating her image. She was a legacy sorority member, a staple at every exclusive charity gala in Buckhead, and a prominent donor at the local historically black colleges. She weaponized every single one of those connections against me. The whispers started by Wednesday. By Friday, they were a deafening roar. Vivian sat at her country club luncheons, sipping mimosas she bought on credit, and spun a masterful web of lies. She told the wives of judges, politicians, and banking executives that I was a cold-blooded sociopath. She claimed that I had maliciously stolen Bryce's intellectual property and used it to inflate my own company's valuation. According to her twisted narrative, they had taken me in, nurtured my business, and I had repaid them by pushing my own family to the brink of financial ruin. She painted herself as the heartbroken matriarch who was simply trying to save her ungrateful child from greed. She knew exactly which buttons to push to garner sympathy in a community that values family loyalty above almost anything else. Jasmine, of course, took the smear campaign to a public level. My sister always knew how to perform for an audience. She booked an interview on one of the most popular business and culture podcasts in the city, a show that catered specifically to young Black entrepreneurs and professionals. I sat in my office and watched the broadcast on my secondary monitor, feeling a mixture of absolute disgust and grudging respect for her sheer audacity. Jasmine sat in the studio wearing a modest pastel dress that completely contradicted her usual flashy style. She squeezed out real tears for the camera. She looked directly into the lens and wiped her eyes. "It is just so painful," Jasmine told the host, her voice trembling perfectly. "You spend your whole life supporting your younger sister, clapping for her wins, making sure she has a seat at the table. And then she turns around and steals your husband's proprietary code. Bryce worked for years on that algorithm. Kiara used her corporate leverage to strip it from him, and now she is trying to bankrupt my parents just to silence them. The psychological abuse we have endured from her is something I would not wish on my worst enemy. She is taking wealth away from her own family to fund her own ego." The host ate it up. The comments section exploded with outrage. People who had never met me were calling for boycotts of Vanguard Horizon. In the venture capital world, reputation is the hardest currency you possess. Trust is everything. And Vivian and Jasmine were methodically draining my accounts without touching a single bank ledger. The fallout was immediate, and it hit me where it actually hurt: the money. On Monday morning, I lost a major deal I had been negotiating for 6 months. The founder of a highly anticipated artificial intelligence startup called my private line and awkwardly backed out. He mentioned that his mother was in the same sorority chapter as Vivian, and that his family did not feel comfortable taking money from someone who would exploit their own flesh and blood. 2 hours later, the lead partner of a massive pension fund that supplied a significant portion of our liquidity sent me a terse email. They were pausing their capital commitments pending an internal review of our ethical guidelines. My corporate phone rang relentlessly. Journalists were asking for statements. Limited partners were demanding emergency meetings. The stock of the publicly traded companies heavily backed by my fund took a noticeable hit. The market hates instability, and my family had just turned my name into a walking public relations disaster. They were attacking the very foundation of my independence. I sat at my desk watching the red numbers flash across my terminal. They thought they could break me by isolating me. They thought that if they destroyed my social standing and threatened my financial backing, I would come crawling back to them begging for a public reconciliation. They expected me to pay them off to make the bad press go away. It was a classic extortion tactic wrapped in the guise of family drama. They wanted me to feel the same helpless panic I felt when I was 15 years old, alone in a dark house. They wanted me to believe that without their approval, I would be nothing. But I did not panic. I simply opened a new encrypted file on my computer and began compiling the counteroffensive. I had receipts, I had tracking numbers. I had every piece of correspondence that proved Bryce was a fraud and my parents were financially destitute. I was just waiting for the perfect moment to deploy them. My assistant buzzed my intercom, her voice tight with absolute panic cutting through my thoughts. Kiara, the board of directors, just called an emergency session. They bypassed my desk completely. They are demanding your presence in the executive boardroom right now. I closed my laptop and smoothed down the front of my blazer. A board meeting meant my major investors were officially spooked. This was the moment Vivian and Marcus were counting on. They wanted my investors to force my hand to make me step down or comply with their demands to save the fund. I took a deep breath, centering myself. I had fought too hard and climbed too high to let a coordinated smear campaign take me down. I gathered my legal files and my pristine financial records. I was ready to walk in there and defend my numbers, my ethics, and my leadership. I walked down the long glass hallway, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished floor. I reached the frosted double doors of the executive boardroom and pushed them open, fully prepared to face down 5 of the most powerful institutional investors in the state of Georgia. I was ready to give the presentation of my life and prove that Vanguard Horizon was impenetrable. But the investors were not looking at the presentation screen. They were looking at the man sitting comfortably at the head of the long mahogany table. My breath caught in my throat and my grip tightened on my files. Sitting in my chair in my boardroom, right next to a high-powered corporate litigator in a $3,000 suit, was my father. Marcus smiled at me, his eyes gleaming with malicious triumph as he adjusted his expensive silk tie. I did not stop walking. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my chin high, and my expression completely void of whatever shock they were hoping to provoke. I bypassed the empty chairs and took my rightful place at the opposite end of the long mahogany table, directly facing the man who had abandoned me 12 years ago. The 5 institutional investors sitting between us shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The air in the room was thick with a suffocating tension. These were individuals representing billions of dollars in pension funds and university endowments. They did not like surprises, and they absolutely despised public scandals. Before I could even open my mouth to address the board, the high-powered corporate litigator sitting next to my father stood up. He smoothed the front of his tailored suit and placed his hands flat on the table, projecting an air of absolute authority. "Good morning, members of the board," the lawyer began, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet room. "My name is Charles Vance. I represent Marcus Sterling, the original founder and majority shareholder of the entity you now know as Vanguard Horizon. We have called this emergency session because it has become painfully clear that the current acting chief executive officer, Kiara Sterling, is no longer fit to manage this firm. Her recent erratic behavior and the severe public relations crisis she has brought upon this family and this fund prove that she is a massive liability to your investments." I watched as the lead investor, a sharp-eyed woman named Valerie, narrowed her gaze at me. The smear campaign my mother and sister had orchestrated all week was doing exactly what it was designed to do. It had planted the seed of doubt. Charles Vance reached into his sleek leather briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper encased in a protective plastic sleeve. He slid it down the center of the glass table. It stopped right in front of Valerie. "What you are looking at is the original certificate of incorporation, filed 12 years ago," the lawyer stated confidently. "This document proves that Marcus Sterling provided the initial seed capital and established the foundational corporate structure of this fund. At the time, he placed the holding company under the name of his minor daughter as part of a generational wealth transfer strategy. It was a blind trust meant to be managed collectively. However, Kiara went rogue. She locked her own family out of the corporate accounts, hijacked the board structure, and is now attempting to drain the very wealth her father created. We are here today to officially invoke Mr. Sterling's right to reclaim executive control, and we demand that Kiara be stripped of all operational power effectively immediately. Marcus leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers under his chin. He looked around the room, soaking in the stunned silence of the investors. He wore the mask of a deeply disappointed patriarch, a man who had supposedly given his daughter the world, only to be stabbed in the back. It was a masterful performance of respectability politics, tailored perfectly to manipulate a room full of wealthy elites. Valerie looked down at the yellowed piece of paper and then up at me. Kiara, she said, her voice tight with concern. This is a very serious allegation. If this firm was founded on misappropriated family assets, and you have deliberately locked out the primary stakeholder, we have a fiduciary duty to intervene. We cannot have our capital tied up in a fraudulent ownership dispute. What exactly is this document? I did not rush to answer. I slowly stood up from my chair, buttoning the center button of my blazer. I walked around the edge of the table, my heels clicking in a slow, deliberate rhythm that commanded the attention of every single person in the room. I walked until I was standing right behind Valerie, looking down at the document. I know exactly what that document is, I said, my voice dangerously soft, but carrying clearly across the room. It is not a generational wealth transfer. It is a murder weapon. Marcus scoffed loudly, shaking his head. Do not listen to her theatrics, he told the board, waving a dismissive hand. She has always been emotionally unstable. This is a simple legal matter of ownership. I ignored him, keeping my eyes locked on the investors. Let me tell you a story about the great Marcus Sterling and his legendary financial acumen, I said, pacing slowly toward the large media console at the front of the room. 12 years ago, Marcus did indeed file that paperwork. He created a company called Sterling Holdings, but it was not a venture capital firm. It did not have a portfolio. It did not have a legitimate business model. What it did have was a series of fake invoices, offshore routing numbers, and millions of dollars of illicit money being funneled through it to avoid federal taxes. It was a massive, sloppy money laundering operation. The boardroom went dead silent. Charles Vance opened his mouth to object, but I cut him off sharply. Do not interrupt me when I am saving my investors from a criminal, I snapped, glaring at the lawyer before turning back to the board. When the IRS began auditing the local businesses Marcus was tied to, he panicked. He knew the federal government was closing in, and that he was facing decades in federal prison. So the great patriarch sitting before you did what any coward would do. He exploited a legal loophole. He forged documents to transfer the entire liability of that shell corporation into the name of his 15-year-old daughter. Then he packed up his wife and his golden child in the middle of the night and fled across state lines. I stopped pacing and turned to look directly at Marcus. The smug smile had completely vanished from his face. His skin had taken on an ashen gray hue. He gripped the armrests of his chair so tightly I could hear the leather creaking. They left me in a house with no electricity, no heat, and no food. I continued, my voice dropping an octave, wrapping around the room like a vice. They left a single sticky note on the kitchen counter that said, "You will figure it out." They did not leave me there to build character. They left me there as bait. They fully expected the federal agents to kick down the door of that house and find a terrified teenager holding the bag for $5 million in federal tax fraud. They threw me to the wolves so they could walk away clean. That is an absolute lie, Marcus roared, jumping up from his chair. His face was contorted with rage, the polished mask completely shattered. She is making this up to cover her own tracks. She stole my company, and now she is slandering me to save her own skin. Demand a vote right now. I demand you vote her out. Valerie held up a hand, silencing him. Her eyes were wide, fixed entirely on me. Kiara, she said cautiously, these are massive allegations. If what you are saying is true, how did you possibly survive a federal indictment at 15 years old? How did that shell company become Vanguard Horizon? I walked over to the media console and placed my hand on the digital projector panel. Because I did exactly what they told me to do, Valerie. I figured it out. I did not cry when the federal agents showed up. I cooperated. I filed for legal emancipation. I spent the next 5 years living in cheap apartments working 3 jobs to pay off the restructured tax debt that I negotiated directly with the government. I took the empty shell of a company my father abandoned, legally purged it of his toxic liabilities, and rebuilt it brick by brick. I secured the first legitimate seed funding. I pitched the first legitimate clients. I built Vanguard Horizon entirely from the ashes of his crimes. He does not own a single fraction of a percent of this firm. He never did. Charles Vance slammed his hands on the table, trying to regain control of the narrative. This is an incredible fairy tale, he sneered, looking around at the investors. A very touching sob story meant to distract you from the facts. But the fact remains that my client has the original incorporation documents. Unless the CEO can produce physical evidence to back up this wild defamatory story about tax evasion, my client maintains his claim to executive control. Board members, I urge you to vote for her immediate dismissal before she sinks this fund completely. Marcus puffed out his chest, regaining a fraction of his false confidence. You heard my lawyer, he said, pointing a trembling finger at me. You are done, Kiara. Your little joyride is over. Now hand over the company, or we take this to court and destroy whatever is left of your reputation. I looked at the man who had brought me into this world. I looked at the profound greed and entitlement burning in his eyes. He actually believed he had won. He actually believed he could walk back into my life, drop a 12-year-old piece of paper on a table, and steal my empire. He thought I was still the scared little girl trembling in the dark. You say this is your company, Marcus? I asked, a slow, cold smile spreading across my face. You are absolutely desperate to claim ownership of Sterling Holdings and all of its historical financial activities. Yes, Marcus snapped, jutting his chin out. I am the founder. I am the owner. Wonderful, I replied. I tapped the screen of the media console, instantly turning on the massive projector behind me. The entire wall lit up with high-resolution scans of documents. But they were not investment portfolio. They were banking ledgers, wire transfer receipts, and forged signature analyses. And right in the center of the screen, displayed in bright bold letters, was the official seal of the Internal Revenue Service, Criminal Investigation Division. The investors gasped in unison. Charles Vance physically recoiled from the table, staring at the screen in absolute horror. Then, Marcus, I suggest you prepare a very strong defense, I said, my voice echoing with finality. Because if you are officially claiming ownership of all original assets and liabilities from 12 years ago, you might want to explain to your lawyer why I submitted this entire mountain of evidence regarding your historical tax evasion to the IRS field office at exactly 8 o'clock this morning. I watched the exact moment my father's soul left his body. The projection screen behind me illuminated his face in a harsh white glow, casting long shadows across his suddenly hollow cheeks. Charles Vance, the high-priced corporate litigator, scrambled to gather his papers. His hands shaking so violently, he dropped his gold pen on the carpet. He knew a sinking ship when he saw one. The institutional investors sitting around the table stared at the damning evidence of federal tax evasion displayed on the wall, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the fraud that had just been exposed. But I was not finished. My eyes drifted away from the pathetic shell of the man who donated his DNA to me. I turned my gaze slowly, letting it sweep across the silent room until it locked onto the man standing frozen near the frosted glass doors. Bryce. Just 20 minutes ago, my white brother-in-law had leaned over this very table, dripping with unearned arrogance, mansplaining the basic concepts of venture capital to me. He had married into the Sterling family, believing he had secured a golden ticket into the upper echelons of Atlanta's elite. He had bought the illusion hook, line, and sinker. Now the curtain was pulled back and he was staring at the ugly, bankrupt reality. I watched his physical unraveling. His expensive tailored vest suddenly looked like a straitjacket. The color drained from his face, leaving a sickly pale hue behind. He looked frantically between the projector screen showing Marcus's criminal tax files and the panicked face of his wife. Wait, Bryce stammered, his voice cracking, pitching an octave higher than his usual confident baritone. What do you mean, the IRS? Marcus, you said you had liquidity. You said the Vanguard Fund was basically a family piggy bank. I leveraged my personal condominium for this quarter's payroll because you promised to underwrite the bridge loan. You told me the family trust was bulletproof. Jasmine rushed to his side, grabbing his forearm with her manicured hands. Her voice was high-pitched and frantic, desperate to maintain the facade of her perfect affluent marriage. "Baby, we will fix this," she pleaded, looking up at him with wide, terrified eyes. "My sister is just throwing a tantrum. She forged those documents to scare us. Kiara, stop lying to him right now. Tell him you are lying." I let out a sharp laugh that echoed off the boardroom walls, cutting through her desperate pleas. "Nobody is lying to him, Jasmine," I said. "Except you." I walked back to my seat, picked up a secondary file, a heavy black binder, and walked directly toward Bryce. The room held its breath as I approached him. I did not hand the binder to him. I dropped it onto the glass table right in front of him with a loud, violent smack that made him flinch physically. "You did not come here to ask for a $3 million seed injection, Bryce," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal, absolute calm. "You came here because your angel investors are threatening to sue you for gross negligence and you are drowning in personal debt. You thought your wealthy father-in-law was going to write you a blank check to bail you out of your miserable failures. But Marcus is broke. Vivian is broke. Jasmine is broke. They have been living on credit card debt and vanity for the last 5 years, dodging creditors while pretending to be royalty." Bryce stared at the black binder as if it were a live explosive. "Open the binder, Bryce," I commanded. "Read the cover page." He reached out with trembling fingers and flipped the heavy leather cover open. His eyes darted frantically across the legal jargon printed on the crisp white paper. I watched his breathing turn shallow and erratic. "3 weeks ago, a venture holding group called Apex Capital approached your deeply frustrated investors and bought out their shares at a premium," I explained, making sure my words carried across the room so the board members could hear my strategic execution. "Apex Capital also purchased your outstanding business loans from your commercial bank, absorbing your corporate debt. What you failed to research in your arrogant, careless haste was that Apex Capital is a wholly owned subsidiary of Vanguard Horizon." I took a step closer, invading the personal space he had tried to dominate earlier. "I did not need your permission to invest in your company, Bryce. I already own it. Vanguard Horizon holds exactly 60% of your voting shares. I am your majority stakeholder. I am your boss." Bryce choked on his own breath, stumbling backward as if the words had physically struck him. The arrogant tech bro who thought he could walk into my office and patronize a black woman about business was completely eviscerated. He had nothing left. No leverage, no company, no wealthy family to fall back on. And as my first official act as your majority shareholder, I continued keeping my eyes locked onto his panicked, terrified gaze. "I am exercising my right to terminate the chief executive officer for gross incompetence, financial mismanagement, and breach of fiduciary duty." "You are fired, Bryce. You have no equity. You have no severance package. You have absolutely nothing." The boardroom descended into absolute chaos. Valerie, the lead investor, covered her mouth in shock, completely stunned by the surgical precision of the hostile takeover. Charles Vance, the lawyer, was already inching toward the door, trying to quietly abandon his fraudulent clients before the authorities arrived. Marcus sat slumped in his chair, utterly defeated. But the real explosion happened by the doors. Bryce's breathing became heavy and ragged, sounding like a cornered animal. The realization that he was totally bankrupt, that his company was gone, and that his wife had lied to him about her family's wealth pushed him violently over the edge. The veneer of the civilized businessman completely vanished. He turned slowly toward Jasmine. Jasmine reached out for him, crying hysterically, telling him they could sue me, that they could fight this hostile takeover in court if they just stuck together. But Bryce was not looking at her with love or partnership. He was looking at her with unhinged, savage rage. "You lied to me!" Bryce hissed, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson, a stark contrast to his pale complexion moments ago. "You told me your family was royalty. You told me Marcus was a billionaire. I put my house on the line for you. I put everything on the line because you swore you were an heiress. You are nothing but a broke fraud." "Bryce, please," Jasmine sobbed, stepping backward as he advanced on her, her expensive heels catching on the carpet. "I did not know. I swear I did not know it was this bad. We can fix it." "You lying witch!" Bryce roared, the sound guttural and violent. Before my security guards could even react to the escalating threat, Bryce lunged forward. His hands shot out and wrapped violently around Jasmine's throat. He slammed her backward against the frosted glass wall of the boardroom with a sickening thud. The impact shook the glass panels. Jasmine shrieked a terrible, strangled sound, clawing frantically at his thick wrists as he squeezed, pinning her against the wall. Her perfectly styled hair fell into her face as she gasped for air, kicking her legs in a desperate panic. The perfect golden family, the elite untouchable dynasty that had abused me and discarded me like trash, was finally tearing each other apart from the inside out. I stood perfectly still, watching the monster they created devour them alive. My security guards did not wait for my command this time. They lunged across the boardroom, pulling Bryce off my sister. He fought them wild and uncoordinated, but they easily wrestled him toward the heavy oak doors. He was screaming obscenities at Jasmine, calling her a fraud, a liar, a gold digger who had absolutely no gold. The heavy doors slammed shut behind him, cutting off his frantic shouting, leaving a ringing silence in my executive boardroom. Jasmine collapsed onto the plush carpet, coughing and gasping for air. Her flawless silk dress was twisted, her immaculate hair ruined. She looked up at Marcus and Vivian, expecting her devoted parents to rush to her side. But Marcus was still staring blankly at the projector screen displaying his federal tax fraud evidence, and Vivian was clutching her designer handbag, looking utterly paralyzed by the sudden evaporation of her social standing. Neither of them moved a muscle to comfort their golden child. Jasmine slowly turned her head toward me. The realization dawned on her that the only person in this room with any actual power was the sister she had spent a lifetime mocking. She scrambled to her feet, stumbling over her expensive heels, and rushed toward my end of the table. "Kiara, please," Jasmine sobbed, reaching out to grab the edge of my blazer. I stepped back smoothly, letting her hands grasp nothing but empty air. "You have to fix this," Jasmine pleaded, her voice raspy from Bryce's grip. "You have to give him the company back. If you give Apex Capital back to Bryce, he will forgive me. He will come back. I cannot be a divorced woman in my social circle, Kiara. My sorority sisters will laugh at me. The country club will revoke my status. You have to undo this." I looked down at her. She was not crying because her husband had just violently assaulted her. She was crying because her country club membership was in jeopardy. The sheer depth of her superficiality was staggering. "I did not do anything to your marriage, Jasmine," I said, my voice cool and detached. "I made a strategic business acquisition. You are the one who lied to your husband about being an heiress to a non-existent fortune. You built your entire life on a foundation of sand, and now you are mad at the ocean for washing it away." "But I only did what Mom and Dad told me to do," Jasmine wailed, pointing a trembling finger at our paralyzed parents. "They told me to marry a tech founder. They told me to pretend we had generational wealth so he would put my name on his assets. They said it was an investment for the family. It is not my fault. You have all this money, Kiara. You have this massive building and these rich investors. You can afford to lose one little supply chain startup. You will figure it out." "But I cannot lose Bryce." There it was, "You will figure it out." I stood completely still, letting the words hang in the conditioned air of the boardroom. 12 years ago, that phrase was a death sentence written on a yellow sticky note. It was meant to break me. It was meant to be the last thing I ever read before the federal government dragged me away. But standing here now, looking down at my older sister, trembling on my expensive carpet, the phrase did not hurt. It did not trigger the scared 15-year-old girl. Instead, a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. I looked down at her from my absolute height of power. "You are 29 years old, Jasmine," I said, my voice dropping to a smooth, lethal whisper. "You are draped in thousands of dollars of imported silk and custom jewelry. You have a master's degree from a prestigious, historically black university that you did not even pay for. And you are telling me that you cannot figure it out." Jasmine stopped crying. She stared up at me, confusion mixing with the fear in her eyes. "That is remarkably strange to me." I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step toward her, forcing her to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. "Because 12 years ago, a 15-year-old girl with an empty stomach, no electricity, and a federal tax indictment hanging over her head figured it out just fine. I figured out how to forge emancipation papers so I would not get thrown into the foster system." I figured out how to negotiate a repayment plan with the Internal Revenue Service. I figured out how to build a venture capital firm while you were busy taking yacht trips on Bryce's credit cards. So do not stand in my boardroom and tell me to figure it out so you can save your miserable, fraudulent marriage. The institutional investors still seated at the table exchanged alarmed glances. Valerie, the lead investor who had been ready to strip me of my title just 10 minutes ago, now watched my sister commit textbook extortion in front of half a dozen witnesses. But Jasmine did not care who was watching. She was desperate. And a desperate golden child who has never been told no is the most dangerous kind of animal. The desperation in Jasmine's eyes instantly vanished. The helpless, sobbing sister routine disappeared, completely replaced by the vicious, venomous woman who had spent all week dragging my name through the mud on local podcasts. She slowly stood up, smoothing down her ruined dress, her posture shifting from submissive to threatening. "You think you are so smart?" Jasmine hissed, her voice turning sharp and cruel. "You think because you sit in a glass tower you are untouchable. You are not untouchable, Kiara." She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a sleek manila folder. She did not open it, she just tapped it against the glass table, a dark, malicious smile spreading across her bruised neck. "Mom is not just a socialite, Kiara. She knows how to protect her investments," Jasmine said, gesturing to Vivian, who suddenly looked very interested in the conversation. "When Mom realized you might try to fight us on the funding round, she made sure we had an insurance policy." "Did you really think we would walk into your office blindly without a backup plan?" I did not say a word. I simply watched her, waiting for her to reveal the next layer of their delusion. Vivian finally found her voice, stepping forward to stand shoulder to shoulder with her favorite daughter. "You should listen to your sister, Kiara." Vivian said, her tone dripping with false maternal concern, hiding a razor-sharp threat. "The Black elite community in this city already thinks you are a monster because of the interviews we did. If this folder leaks, they will demand your head on a platter. Your investors will flee. Your reputation will be ashes. Do the smart thing for once in your life. Give your sister her husband's company back and write the check." I looked from Vivian to Jasmine. They had spent 12 years ignoring my existence, only to return and weaponize my own success against me. They had forged federal documents. They were openly blackmailing a chief executive officer in her own headquarters. They truly believed that because I shared their blood, I would eventually fold under their coordinated pressure. They thought they had backed me into a corner. "This folder contains financial records," Jasmine sneered, tapping the cardboard against the table again. "It contains documents proving that you embezzled your initial seed capital from a minority development grant. It shows forged signatures, offshore routing numbers, and a very detailed paper trail connecting your personal accounts to fraudulent charities in Atlanta." I stared at the folder. "You fabricated financial documents," I stated flatly. "We created a narrative," Jasmine corrected, her smile widening into something truly ugly. "And as you have seen this week, my network is incredibly powerful. I can make one phone call right now and have this folder sitting on the desk of every major financial journalist in the state of Georgia by noon. I can hand this over to the federal authorities. It does not matter if the documents are entirely fabricated, Kiara. The investigation alone will freeze your assets. Your institutional investors will pull their capital immediately. You will lose everything. The government will take Vanguard Horizon, and you will be right back to being that starving 15-year-old girl." She took a step closer to me, her eyes burning with pure malice. "So here is what is going to happen, little sister," Jasmine demanded, her voice echoing in the quiet room. "You are going to sign a transfer deed giving me full executive control of Apex Capital. You are going to deposit $3 million into Bryce's personal holding account so I can leverage his return. And you are going to do it right now, or I swear to God, I will walk out of this building and burn your entire life to the ground." Jasmine stood there holding that manila folder like it was the Holy Grail. She actually believed she had outsmarted a venture capitalist who navigated corporate espionage before breakfast. I looked at the folder, then at my mother's triumphant face, and finally at my father, who was already puffing his chest out again. I needed them to feel powerful. I needed them so drunk on their own perceived victory that they would march blindly into the slaughterhouse. I let my shoulders drop just a fraction. I allowed my breathing to hitch, performing the exact physical manifestation of defeat they were waiting for. I looked away from Jasmine's piercing gaze staring down at my mahogany table. You would really do that, I said, pitching my voice softly, layering it with fabricated disbelief. You would send fake documents to the federal authorities and destroy everything I built just to save Bryce. Vivian stepped forward, placing a manicured hand on my glass table. We are protecting the family, Kiara. You forced our hand when you decided to be greedy. Now are you going to sign the transfer papers? Or are we making that phone call to the press? I let out a slow, trembling breath. If the federal government freezes Vanguard Horizon, thousands of minority founders lose their funding. You would be destroying black wealth across the entire East Coast. Marcus scoffed. That is your cross to bear, girl, not ours. Write the check. I stood perfectly still for a long moment, letting the silence stretch until it was almost unbearable. Then I slowly reached into the inside pocket of my blazer and pulled out my signature pen. I let it hover over the table. Fine, I whispered, shaking my head as if I had no other choice. You win. I will wire $3 million into Bryce's holding account, and I will draft the executive transfer deed for Apex Capital. I will give him his company back. Jasmine let out a sharp, breathless laugh of pure victory. She clutched the fake blackmail folder to her chest, her posture instantly morphing back into the arrogant sorority queen. She looked at Vivian with a victorious smirk, totally convinced that she had just strong-armed a titan of industry. But I said, my voice hardening just enough to make them pause. I have one condition, and it is non-negotiable. Vivian narrowed her eyes. You are not in a position to make demands, Kiara. It is a very simple demand, I countered, crossing my arms. You have spent the entire week dragging my name through the mud on podcasts, at country club luncheons, and across every high society circle in Atlanta. If I am giving up $3 million and a lucrative tech acquisition, I need my reputation restored. I need a public apology. Marcus let out a booming laugh. You want us to say sorry after what you put us through? I want it public, I insisted, locking eyes with my father. This Saturday is the annual HBCU Alumni Excellence Gala at the Four Seasons. The entire Black elite of Atlanta will be in that ballroom. Investors, politicians, Greek letter organizations. I am the diamond sponsor of that event. You will all attend. You will stand on that stage and you will publicly apologize for the misunderstandings of this past week. You will state that Vanguard Horizon is an ethical, independently run firm. You do that, and the moment you step off that stage, the transfer deed is signed and the money hits Bryce's account. I watched the three of them exchange glances. They were calculating the optics. They were addicted to the spotlight, and the HBCU Gala was the biggest social event of the season. To be invited as VIP guests of the Diamond sponsor was a massive ego boost. It was the exact type of validation they craved more than oxygen. Jasmine leaned toward my mother, whispering loudly enough for me to hear. We can spin it, Mom. We can get up there and say we forgive her. We can make it look like we are the bigger people welcoming the prodigal daughter back into the fold. It will make us look like saints to the entire alumni network. Vivian's eyes lit up at the prospect of playing the benevolent matriarch in front of all her wealthy friends. She could already see the applause. She could already taste the validation. It was the perfect stage for her to cement her false narrative of being the loving, forgiving mother who gracefully handled a difficult child. We accept your terms, Vivian said, lifting her chin with regal arrogance. We will be at the gala this Saturday. We will make a statement regarding the family reconciliation. Have the paperwork ready to sign the minute the speeches are done. And Kiara, if you try to double-cross us, this folder goes straight to the feds. I understand, I said, keeping my face entirely blank. I will see you on Saturday. They did not even say goodbye. They turned around and marched out of my boardroom, their heads held high, completely intoxicated by their perceived triumph. I stood alone in the quiet room, listening to their footsteps fade down the glass hallway. The facade of defeat melted off my face instantly. I did not feel fear. I did not feel intimidated. I felt the cold, terrifying thrill of a hunter watching the prey walk directly into the snare. Later that evening, my penthouse was completely quiet. The city of Atlanta glowed beneath my floor-to-ceiling windows, a sprawling grid of gold and white lights stretching into the horizon. I walked slowly across my expansive living room, the thick carpet silencing my steps. I held a crystal glass of expensive red wine in one hand, the deep burgundy liquid catching the reflection of the city lights. I took a slow sip, savoring the complex notes of the vintage. My family thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought a fake manila folder and a few empty threats could dismantle a woman who had fought her way out of poverty and federal tax debt. They truly believed I was handing them $3 million in a tech company just to save face. They had no idea that I never intended to give them a single dime. The apology at the gala was never about my reputation. It was about gathering all of them in one heavily populated, highly publicized room where they could not escape. They were going to walk onto a stage illuminated by spotlights, surrounded by the very people they spent their entire lives trying to impress. And I was going to lock the doors. I set my wine glass down on the cold marble kitchen island and picked up my encrypted mobile phone. I dialed a specific direct line that I had saved in my contacts for the past 3 weeks. The line rang twice before a deep professional voice answered. "Agent Miller," the voice said. "Good evening, Agent Miller," I replied, staring out at the sparkling city skyline. "This is Kiara Sterling, Miss Sterling. We have been reviewing the extensive financial files you uploaded to our secure portal regarding Marcus and Vivian Sterling. The evidence of historical tax fraud and offshore money laundering is staggering. We were preparing to request warrants." "I have an update for you," I said, leaning against the marble counter. "The targets just attempted to extort me for $3 million using fabricated financial documents. They threatened to disrupt a federal minority grant program if I did not comply." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Extortion and fabricating federal financial documents. That gives us immediate grounds for arrest. Do you know their current location? "They are currently highly mobile and dodging creditors," I explained smoothly. "But I have arranged a guaranteed location for apprehension. They will be attending the HBCU Alumni Excellence Gala this Saturday night at the Four Seasons Hotel in downtown Atlanta. They believe they are arriving to collect an extortion payout. They will all be in the main ballroom by 9 o'clock. The bait is taken." Agent Miller confirmed, his tone shifting into pure operational mode. "We will have a plainclothes agent securing the perimeter and the main exits of the ballroom. We will prepare the net for the gala. Thank you for your cooperation, Miss Sterling." "Just doing my civic duty, Agent Miller," I said. I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the counter. I picked up my wine glass and took another slow, deliberate sip. My mother wanted a public spectacle. My father wanted to reclaim his false legacy. Jasmine wanted to maintain her high society illusion. I was going to give them exactly what they asked for. I was going to give them the biggest, most unforgettable spectacle the Atlanta elite had ever witnessed. And I was going to burn their entire empire to the ground in front of everyone they ever wanted to impress. I remember the blinding flash of the cameras the moment I stepped out of my matte black car and let the valet close the door behind me. The humid Atlanta night air was instantly pierced by the shouting of local society photographers. I walked onto the red carpet at the Four Seasons leading into the grand ballroom, wearing a custom emerald green gown that swept the floor. It was not just a dress. It was a piece of armor designed specifically to command the exact room I was about to destroy. I allowed a slow, cold smile to touch my lips as I glided past the velvet ropes. Tonight was the night the grand illusion shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Inside the ballroom, the atmosphere was dripping with manufactured prestige. The massive room was a sea of tailored tuxedos and sparkling ball gowns, representing the absolute pinnacle of Atlanta's black elite. Politicians, hospital administrators, university board members, and legacy fraternity alumni mingled under massive crystal chandeliers. Waiters in white gloves circulated with silver trays of champagne and caviar. And right in the center of the room, basking in the glow of the flashing cameras and the undivided attention of their wealthy peers, were Marcus and Vivian. I did not hide in the shadows. I walked directly toward the champagne tower, picking up a crystal flute and positioning myself just close enough to hear them spinning their toxic web. Vivian was holding court with the wives of 3 prominent local judges. She had one hand elegantly placed over her heart, wearing her signature pearls, playing the role of the benevolent, heartbroken matriarch to absolute perfection. "We are just so relieved to bring her back into the fold." Vivian sighed, her voice carrying that perfectly practiced tone of maternal martyrdom. You know how it is when a child loses her way and forgets her roots. We gave Kiara every advantage, but she always had a rebellious streak. Marcus and I decided it was time to step in and save her from her own chaotic decisions. We are taking over the operational control of her little firm to ensure she does not ruin her future. It is a terrible burden on us, but family is family. We must protect our own. Bring her back into the fold. Bring her back into the fold. The phrase echoed in my mind, a sickening repetition of their absolute delusion. They did not want to bring me back into the fold. They wanted to consume me. They wanted to devour the financial empire I built with my own blood and sweat and wear my success like a designer accessory. Bring her back into the fold meant locking me back in that dark, freezing house with no electricity. It meant chaining me to their massive failures. But I was not the prey anymore. I was the predator holding the keys to the cage. I watched Jasmine standing a few feet away from Vivian. My sister caught my eye across the room. She offered a vicious, victorious smirk and deliberately tapped the side of her expensive designer clutch. I knew exactly what she was signaling. The fabricated manila folder. The fake financial documents she thought she was using to blackmail me. She actually believed she had me on a leash. Before I could even take a sip of my champagne, a heavy hand clamped down on my bare shoulder. I turned slowly, looking up into the smug, flushed face of my brother-in-law, Bryce. I was holding a glass of scotch, standing shoulder to shoulder with two older conservative investors who I recognized from a competing wealth management firm. Bryce had clearly been drinking deeply, inhaling the false confidence my parents had fed him earlier that week. He actually believed the transfer deed to his failed tech company was waiting for him at the end of the night. Kiara Bryce said, his voice booming loudly enough to draw the attention of the surrounding guests. He puffed out his chest, looking down at me with a sickeningly familiar smirk of unearned authority. I was just telling Richard and Thomas here about the upcoming restructuring at Vanguard Horizon. I know giving up the reins is tough for you, but let us be honest with ourselves. Venture capital is a brutal arena. It requires a certain aggressive pedigree to sustain a portfolio. It is just not an environment built for a young black woman flying solo. You need a firm, experienced hand at the wheel to mitigate the risk and fix the mess you made. He took a sip of his scotch, leaning in closer, his breath hot and smelling heavily of alcohol. Do not worry, little sister, he whispered, a nasty warning edge creeping into his tone. I will make sure you still have a desk somewhere in the back office once I take over Apex Capital and bring Vanguard back under the Sterling family umbrella. We will give you a seat at the table. A small one, but a seat nonetheless. A seat at the table. A seat at the table. He said it with such casual, violent entitlement. He thought he could walk into a room funded by my capital stand among the elite society I dominated and diminish my existence to a charity case. He thought a seat at the table was his to give. He did not realize I owned the table, the chairs, the room, and the building itself. I looked at the two older investors who were watching the exchange with mild amusement, clearly enjoying the spectacle of a man putting a younger woman in her place. I did not raise my voice. I did not break my composure. I simply tilted my head and offered Bryce a smile, so devoid of human warmth, it made him physically take a half step back. It is truly fascinating that you speak so passionately about mitigating risk. Bryce, I said, my voice smooth and carrying a sharp, crystalline clarity that cut through the ambient noise of the party. Especially considering your own track record with risk management involves leveraging your personal home to cover payroll for an algorithm that is currently under active federal investigation for mass data theft. But please do continue lecturing me on the intricacies of venture capital. It is incredibly educational. The two older investors immediately stiffened their amused smiles, vanishing instantly as they quickly stepped away from Bryce, not wanting to be associated with the phrase active federal investigation. Bryce's face drained of all color, his jaw clenching as he realized I was not playing the submissive, defeated role he had scripted for me. You are playing a very dangerous game, Kiara, he hissed, stepping closer, dropping all pretense of civility. You think you can embarrass me tonight. You think you can back out of the deal. Jasmine has the folder. We have the documents. You are going to sign that transfer deed the second the speeches are over, or we will burn you to the ground right here in front of everyone. I took a slow, elegant sip of my champagne, never breaking eye contact. I am counting on it, Bryce, I whispered. Suddenly, the heavy orchestral music playing in the background faded out, replaced by a sharp, dynamic drum beat. The grand lighting in the ballroom dimmed down, shifting into a focused, brilliant spotlight, illuminating the massive stage at the front of the room. The chatter of 500 elite guests fell into a hushed, expectant silence as the master of ceremonies, a prominent local news anchor, stepped up to the crystal podium. Ladies and gentlemen, the master of ceremonies announced, his voice booming through the state-of-the-art sound system. Welcome to the annual Alumni Excellence Gala. Tonight we celebrate the titans of our community, the innovators, the leaders, and the visionaries who paved the way for the next generation of Black excellence. The crowd erupted into polite applause. Vivian and Marcus eagerly moved to the front of the crowd, positioning themselves perfectly in the sightline of the main cameras. Vivian smoothed down her sequined dress, a look of absolute greedy anticipation plastered across her face. She was ready for her moment. She was ready to be called up to the stage to accept my forced public apology and claim her stolen glory. But before we begin our award presentations, the Master of Ceremonies continued, holding up a hand to quiet the room. We must give our profound thanks to the individual who made this entire magnificent evening possible. This event, this venue, and the millions of dollars in scholarships we are awarding tonight are entirely funded by our sole diamond sponsor. The spotlight swept rapidly across the dark ballroom, searching through the sea of expensive suits and sparkling dresses. Please direct your attention to the center of the room and join me in welcoming to the stage a true titan of the financial sector, the founder and chief executive officer of Vanguard Horizon, Kiara Sterling. The spotlight slammed directly onto me, bathing me in a blinding, brilliant white light. Every single eye in that massive ballroom, all 500 guests, the politicians, the judges, the investors, and my utterly paralyzed family snapped directly to me. I handed my champagne glass to a passing waiter. I did not look at Vivian, whose jaw had literally dropped open in shock. I did not look at Marcus, who was staring at the stage in sudden, creeping horror. I kept my eyes locked dead ahead as I walked through the parted crowd, stepping up toward the stage, ready to deliver the final execution. I reached the crystal podium and rested my hands on its cool, smooth edges. The heavy silence in the grand ballroom was absolute. 500 pairs of eyes were locked onto me. The spotlight beat down from the high ceiling, isolating me in a brilliant circle of white. If a camera were circling me right now, it would capture a woman completely at peace in the center of a hurricane. I looked down at the front row. Vivian was practically vibrating with anticipation. She had her hands clasped beneath her chin, giving me an encouraging maternal nod. She was waiting for her tribute. She was waiting for me to bow my head, apologize for my supposed greed, and publicly hand over the keys to my kingdom so she could maintain her flawless society image. Marcus stood tall beside her, puffing his chest out, ready to accept his fabricated glory. Jasmine and Bryce were watching with greedy, wide eyes, mentally cashing the $3 million check I had promised them. I leaned into the microphone. The sound system picked up the quiet, steady intake of my breath. Good evening, everyone. I began, my voice ringing with a calm, absolute authority that bounced off the gilded walls of the Four Seasons. We are gathered here tonight to celebrate legacy. We are here to talk about what we pass down to the next generation of Black excellence. For the past week, my name has been the primary topic of conversation at your country club luncheons, your sorority meetings, and your investment boards. You have heard a very specific story spun by Marcus and Vivian Sterling. You have heard that I am a ruthless, ungrateful daughter who stole a family fortune and drove my parents and my sister to the brink of financial ruin. You were told that tonight I would stand on this stage and issue a formal apology to bring my family back together. A gentle murmur of validation rippled through the front rows. Vivian smiled wider, ready to step up and play the forgiving mother. I raised my hand, signaling the audiovisual team stationed at the back of the ballroom. But Vanguard Horizon does not deal in rumors. I continued, keeping my gaze locked on my mother. We deal in data. We deal in hard, undeniable facts. So tonight, I am going to share my actual family legacy with you. The massive LED screen behind me, spanning 50 feet across the stage, flashed brightly. The ballroom gasped in unison. The image that appeared behind me was not a corporate logo. It was not a transfer deed or a philanthropic check. It was a high-resolution photograph of a small, crinkled yellow piece of paper. The edges were worn and curled. Written across the center in Marcus Sterling's unmistakable, hurried handwriting were 5 words: "You will figure it out." The image loomed over the entire Atlanta elite, casting a harsh yellow glow over the front rows. Vivian's practiced smile vanished instantly, completely wiped away by sheer confusion. Marcus dropped his hands to his sides, staring up at the screen as the blood drained from his face. I gripped the podium, my voice echoing with lethal precision. 12 years ago, Marcus and Vivian Sterling left me a very unique inheritance. They did not leave me a trust fund. They did not leave me a business. They left me a $5 million federal tax debt, a shell company registered illegally in my name, and this single sticky note sitting on the kitchen counter of a house that had its electricity cut off. The silence in the ballroom broke violently. Shocked whispers erupted from the tables of judges, politicians, and university board members. The very people Vivian had lied to all week were now staring at the screen in absolute horror. "I was 15 years old," I said, raising my voice to cut through the rising commotion. While the people in this room believed Marcus and Vivian were expanding their real estate portfolio, they were actually fleeing across state lines to avoid a federal indictment for money laundering and tax fraud. They abandoned their minor daughter, using me as human bait to take the fall for their crimes. Vivian took a stumbling step backward, shaking her head frantically. She looked left and right at the wealthy women who just moments ago had been hanging on her every word. Those women were now physically stepping away from her, pulling their silk dresses aside, as if Vivian were suddenly infectious. "That is what Vanguard Horizon was built from," I declared, pointing to the massive screen behind me. "It was built from the ashes of their cowardice. I emancipated myself. I paid their debts. I built an empire with my own 2 hands. Marcus and Vivian do not own a single fraction of a percent of my company. They have not spoken a single word to me in 12 years. Jasmine was hyperventilating, grabbing Bryce's arm, but Bryce was paralyzed, staring at the screen with wide, terrified eyes. He finally understood the magnitude of the trap they had all walked into. "So why are they here tonight?" I asked the audience, leaning forward into the microphone. "Why did they suddenly track me down after a decade of silence? It is not because they missed their daughter. It is because Marcus and Vivian are currently facing total bank foreclosure on their Maryland estate. It is because my brother-in-law Bryce is under active federal investigation for mass data theft at his failing startup. They came to my office demanding a $3 million bailout. When I refused, they launched a coordinated extortion campaign, threatening to fabricate financial documents to destroy my fund unless I paid them off tonight." The ballroom descended into absolute chaos. Guests were pulling out their phones, recording the massive sticky note on the screen and the spectacular unraveling of the Sterling family below the stage. The elite society of Atlanta, the very weapon my mother had tried to use against me, had just become her ultimate executioner. They were watching her pristine reputation burn to the ground in real time. "They told you I was going to apologize," I said, my voice ringing with absolute finality. "But I do not apologize to extortionists. I do not negotiate with cowards. And I absolutely do not fund criminals." "That is a lie." The roar ripped from the front of the room with savage, violent force. Marcus Sterling, completely stripped of his respectable patriarch facade, lost his mind. His face was purple with unhinged rage, his eyes wide and bloodshot. The narcissist, having his ultimate failure broadcast to the entire world, completely shattered his fragile control. He shoved past Vivian, sending her stumbling into a waiter. He knocked over a massive crystal floral arrangement, sending glass shattering across the polished dance floor. "Shut that screen off!" Marcus screamed, sprinting toward the stage stairs, his heavy footsteps pounding against the wood. "She is a liar. She is a psychotic liar trying to steal my legacy. Turn off the microphone." He charged up the stage steps like a wild animal, his hands outstretched violently, reaching for the crystal podium. He was coming directly for me, intending to physically silence me in front of 500 people. I didn't make it past the second step. 2 members of my private security detail materialized from the shadows near the stage, intercepting him mid-stride. They didn't tackle him, they simply formed an immovable wall of muscle and tailored suits easily holding back the flailing, desperate man who used to terrify me. "Let me go!" Marcus roared, his voice cracking, spittle flying from his lips as he struggled against the security guards. "She's trying to destroy us. This is defamation. I'll sue you for every penny you have, you ungrateful little—" "I'm not trying to destroy you, Marcus," I interrupted, my voice projected clearly through the sound system, cutting over his shouting. "I'm just letting you destroy yourself." I tapped a single button on the discreet remote control resting on the podium. The massive LED screen behind me went black for a split second, and then the crystal-clear, digitally enhanced audio of a recorded conversation flooded the grand ballroom. It was the recording from my office just a few days ago, the one I had captured when Jasmine had brought out the fake manila folder. "You think you can just walk in here and take $3 million? My own voice played through the speakers, calm and deliberate. "We're not taking it, Kiara." Jasmine's voice echoed, dripping with that toxic, arrogant confidence she had wielded like a weapon her entire life. "We're collecting it. Mom and Dad already drafted the transfer deeds. You sign over Apex Capital to Bryce or this folder goes to the press." The ballroom gasped. The sound of hundreds of elite guests, suddenly realizing they were witnessing a felony in real time, was like a physical wave crashing through the room. Vivian, still standing near the front row, covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror. Then Marcus's voice boomed through the recording, unmistakable in its gruff, authoritative tone. "Don't push me, girl. You think I care about those tax files? I forged your name on that IRS paperwork 12 years ago and walked away clean. I'll do it again. I'll fabricate whatever I need to freeze your Vanguard accounts if you don't write that check today. You owe this family." The recording cut off. The silence that followed was heavier than lead. The entire ballroom, filled with the most influential and status-conscious individuals in Atlanta, simply froze. The Black elite, a community that prided itself on legacy, respectability, and flawless public image, was staring at the Sterling family as if they were covered in raw sewage. The murmurs started almost immediately. It wasn't a gentle whispering. It was the sound of a reputation being shredded to pieces. Did he just admit to federal tax fraud? A prominent judge sitting near the front row asked aloud, not even trying to lower his voice. "They tried to extort their own daughter." Another woman, a legacy sorority sister of Vivian's, said, her face twisted in disgust as she physically stepped away from where Vivian was standing. "Vivian told me Kiara was the one stealing from them." Vivian spun around, her perfect manicured facade completely shattered. No, please, you don't understand." She pleaded, her voice shrill and desperate as she reached out to the women she had been gossiping with just 20 minutes prior. "That recording is altered. She manipulated it. We were just trying to help her manage her assets." But the women didn't just ignore her, they actively recoiled. The social ostracization was instantaneous and brutal. In their world, financial ruin was a tragedy, but federal fraud and public extortion were unforgivable sins. Vivian had built her entire identity on being the untouchable matriarch, and now she was watching her social capital evaporate into thin air. She was a pariah. Marcus, still restrained by my security guards at the base of the stage, stopped struggling. He looked around the room, reading the disgust and condemnation on the faces of his peers. The realization that his carefully constructed illusion of wealth and power was permanently destroyed finally settled over him. His shoulders slumped and the fight drained out of him. He looked like exactly what he was, a broke, desperate man caught in a lie. Jasmine was hyperventilating, backing away from her parents, trying to distance herself from the radioactive fallout. She looked wildly around the room, her eyes darting between the judgmental stares of her sorority sisters and the terrifying reality of the evidence I had just broadcasted. But the most spectacular unraveling was happening right next to her. Bryce, who had been standing frozen since the sticky note appeared on the screen, suddenly snapped out of his paralysis. The arrogant, condescending tech bro, who had thought he was marrying into a dynasty of billionaires, finally understood the full, devastating scope of his situation. He hadn't just married into a broke family. He had married into a family of felons who had actively planned to use his failing company as a pawn in an extortion scheme. His face turned a dangerous mottled shade of crimson. He shoved past Jasmine, nearly knocking her over, and sprinted toward the stage steps, completely ignoring my security guards. "Wait! Wait!" Bryce screamed, his voice cracking with panic as he lunged for the spare microphone resting on a stand near the edge of the stage. He gripped it with trembling hands, staring out at the sea of horrified faces. "I had nothing to do with this!" Bryce yelled into the mic, the sound feeding back slightly with a sharp whine. "I didn't know anything about the tax fraud. I didn't know about the extortion. They lied to me." He pointed a shaking finger directly at Jasmine and Vivian. "They told me they had generational wealth." Jasmine swore Marcus had millions in liquid assets. "I leveraged my own house, my personal accounts, because they promised to back my startup. They used me. They're frauds. They're completely broke." Jasmine covered her face with her hands, sobbing uncontrollably as her husband publicly humiliated her, confirming every terrible truth I had just exposed. She was watching her marriage, her status, and her entire future disintegrate under the harsh glare of the ballroom lights. "I'm the victim here," Bryce continued to shout into the microphone, his panic overriding any sense of dignity. "I didn't know Vanguard Horizon had bought my company. I didn't know they were trying to steal $3 million. I'm totally innocent." I watched him flail, watching him desperately try to untangle himself from the sinking ship. He thought throwing his wife and her parents under the bus would save him. He thought his white privilege and his sudden claim of ignorance would shield him from the consequences. I stepped back up to the podium, adjusting the microphone. I looked down at Bryce, who was sweating profusely, gripping the mic stand like a lifeline. "Are you quite finished, Bryce?" I asked, my voice slicing through his frantic babbling. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and pleading. "Kiara, tell them. Tell them I didn't know about the extortion." "You're right, Bryce," I said smoothly, leaning into the mic. "You didn't know about the extortion. You were entirely too incompetent to understand the financial crimes your in-laws were committing." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Bryce's expression faltered, confusion warring with the sheer panic on his face. But I continued, my tone dropping to a lethal quiet register. "Incompetence does not equal innocence." Bryce's mouth opened and closed like a suffocating fish. He looked around the silent ballroom, searching for a single sympathetic face among the hundreds of elite guests. There was none. The very people he had tried to impress, the wealthy investors and corporate titans he thought he was joining by marrying into my family, were looking at him with absolute unfiltered disgust. He had positioned himself at the base of the stage, looking up at me, and for the first time in his privileged life, he looked incredibly small. His expensive designer vest clung to his sweating back. His confident posture had completely collapsed. "You want to stand in front of this entire room and play the victim, Bryce?" I asked, my voice echoing through the sound system. "You want to pretend that you were just a naive, hard-working entrepreneur who was duped by his wicked in-laws. You want everyone here to believe that Vanguard Horizon orchestrated a hostile takeover simply because my family asked me to." "I didn't do anything illegal," Bryce stammered, his voice shaking so badly, the microphone fed back a high-pitched squeal. "My startup was struggling, yes, but that is just venture capital. It is just business. You fired me to get back at Jasmine and Marcus. You ruined my company out of pure family spite." I let out a harsh laugh that rang off the crystal chandeliers. "Your ego is truly spectacular," I said, stepping away from the podium and walking to the edge of the stage. I looked down at him, forcing him to tilt his head back to meet my gaze. "I did not fire you because of my parents, Bryce. I fired you because you are a common thief." The color completely vanished from his face, leaving him a sickly pale white. He gripped the microphone stand so tightly his knuckles looked like they might shatter. I gestured to the audiovisual team at the back of the room. A new slide flashed onto the massive screen behind me, replacing the yellow sticky note. This time it was a series of bank statements highlighted in bright, aggressive red. "Did you really think my acquisitions team would not conduct a forensic audit before absorbing your corporate debt?" I asked, staring down at his terrified eyes. "Did you honestly believe we would not notice the massive gaping hole in your internal payroll structure?" "That is an accounting error," Bryce choked out, taking a desperate step backward. "We were transitioning payroll software. It was a glitch." "It was a wire transfer," I corrected sharply, cutting off his pathetic lie. "A direct routing transfer from your employee pension fund straight into a private offshore holding account, registered under your own name." You did not just fail at building a supply chain algorithm, Bryce. You actively embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars from your own engineers and developers. You stole the retirement savings of the very people working 80-hour weeks to keep your sinking ship afloat. The crowd gasped again. Whispers of pure revulsion rippled through the ballroom. In the corporate world, failure is tolerated, but stealing from your own employees is the ultimate cardinal sin. And what exactly did you do with that stolen pension money, Bryce? I continued, my voice rising in volume, ensuring every single person in the Four Seasons heard the absolute truth. Did you reinvest it into your failing technology? Did you pay your vendors? No. You walked into a luxury dealership in Buckhead and paid cash for the custom matte black Porsche 911 that you drove to my office last Tuesday. Yao bought a luxury sports car with stolen retirement funds, and then you had the absolute audacity to walk into my boardroom and demand $3 million to cover the hole you dug. Bryce was physically shaking now. The microphone slipped from his sweaty palms and clattered loudly onto the carpeted floor. He looked at the bank statements displayed on the massive 50-foot screen behind me. His routing numbers, his signature, his undeniable guilt broadcast to the entire Atlanta elite. The facade of the brilliant tech founder was completely obliterated. He was not a victim of my family's extortion plot. I was a co-conspirator of his own, making a desperate fraudster who thought he could use my capital to cover up his federal crimes. I did not take over your company out of spite, Bryce. I stated, my tone dripping with absolute disdain. I took it over to protect the employees you were actively robbing. I fired you because you are a criminal. Jasmine, who had been standing a few feet away, completely paralyzed by her own public humiliation, suddenly snapped out of her trance. Seeing her husband, her last remaining shield of social status, completely destroyed, triggered a desperate primal panic inside her. She needed the illusion of her marriage to survive this night. She lunged forward, her expensive silk dress tangling around her legs, and grabbed Bryce by his arms. "Bryce, tell them it is a lie!" Jasmine cried, her voice shrill and grating. "Tell them she forged those bank records. We can hire a lawyer. We can sue her for defamation. We can fix this, baby, just look at me. We are a team. We are going to get through this." She clawed at his tailored vest, desperately trying to pull him into an embrace, trying to project the image of a united front against a cruel younger sister. But Bryce was not looking at her with love. The panic in his eyes instantly morphed into pure, unadulterated hatred. He looked at the woman who had lied to him about being an heiress, the woman whose family had just dragged him into a public execution. "Get off me," Bryce roared. He did not just pull away. He violently shoved Jasmine backward. The force of his push sent her stumbling backward on her high heels. She let out a sharp cry as her ankle twisted and she collapsed onto the polished wooden dance floor, landing hard in a tangle of silk and humiliation. Jasmine looked up at him, her eyes wide with shock and betrayal. "Bryce, do not touch me, you lying fraud!" Bryce screamed, pointing a trembling finger down at her. "You ruined my life. You and your psychotic broke family set me up. You told me you were rich. You told me you had connections. You have nothing. You are nothing. I am going to federal prison because I listened to you." Jasmine sat on the floor, sobbing uncontrollably, her perfect makeup streaming down her face in dark, ugly streaks. The golden child, the flawless sorority queen who had spent her entire life mocking my existence, was now crying on the floor of a ballroom, discarded like trash by the very man she had worshipped. She reached a hand out toward our parents, but Vivian was completely frozen, unable to process the destruction of her own social empire, and Marcus was still pinned by my security guards, staring blankly at the floor. The perfect family was dead. They had cannibalized each other the moment the money and the prestige evaporated. I stood on the stage looking down at the wreckage. I did not feel pity. I did not feel sorrow. I felt a profound, icy clarity. They had spent 12 years building a castle out of stolen bricks and lies. All I did was turn on the lights and watch it crumble. Suddenly, the heavy, tense silence in the grand ballroom was pierced by a sound cutting through the thick glass windows of the Four Seasons Hotel. It started as a distant wail echoing through the busy streets of downtown Atlanta. Within seconds, the sound grew louder, sharper, and undeniably clear. The wail of police sirens, multiple sirens approaching rapidly from every direction. The flashing red and blue lights began to reflect against the massive windows of the ballroom, painting the horrified faces of the guests in alternating colors of absolute panic. The authorities had not just arrived, they had surrounded the building. The trap I had meticulously set was finally snapping shut entirely. The flashing red and blue lights painting the high ballroom windows sent a shockwave of raw panic through the Sterling family. The wail of the sirens grew deafeningly loud, echoing off the skyscrapers of downtown Atlanta and piercing right through the thick glass of the Four Seasons. They were no longer the untouchable elite. They were trapped rats in a gilded cage. I stood on the edge of the stage looking down as the reality of federal prison materialized outside the doors. Vivian broke first. The illusion of the poised, wealthy matriarch violently shattered, leaving behind a frantic, cornered woman. She stumbled forward, her expensive heels catching on the carpet, and lunged toward the front row of guests. These were the women she had spent decades cultivating. Her legacy sorority sisters, the wives of politicians, the charity board directors. The women she considered her ultimate safety net. "Please," Vivian begged, her voice shrill and trembling as she reached out with shaking hands. "You have to help me. Call Judge Harrison. Call my lawyer. You know me. You know I would never do these things. My husband lied to me. My daughter is framing me. Tell them. You have to tell them who I am." She grabbed the arm of a prominent state senator's wife, a woman she had just been sipping champagne with 20 minutes ago. The woman looked down at Vivian's hand as if she had just been touched by a diseased animal. She physically pried Vivian's fingers off her silk dress and took a deliberate, disgusted step backward. "Do not touch me," the senator's wife stated, her voice dripping with absolute contempt. "You stole from your own child to fund your vanity. You are a disgrace to this community, Vivian. You are entirely on your own." The entire front row of elite women turned their backs on her in unison. It was the most brutal, definitive social execution I had ever witnessed. Vivian let out a strangled sob, clutching her diamond necklace as she spun around looking for anyone to save her. But the room was a solid wall of judgment. I slowly walked down the short flight of stairs leading off the stage. The crowd parted instantly, creating a wide, clear path for me. The sound of my heels clicking against the polished wooden floor cut through the murmur of the horrified guests. I did not rush. I took my time, savoring every single step until I was standing less than 2 feet away from the woman who had brought me into this world. Vivian looked up at me. Her perfect makeup was ruined, running in dark streaks down her cheeks. She dropped to her knees right there on the ballroom floor, the heavy fabric of her sequined gown pooling around her. She reached out and grabbed the hem of my dress, sobbing hysterically, playing the ultimate victim card, because it was the only trick she had left. "Kiara, please," Vivian wailed, looking up at me with desperate, pleading eyes. "I am your mother. I gave you life. You cannot let them take me away. I did not know about the tax fraud. I swear to you I did not know what Marcus was doing. You have the money. You have the power now. Tell them to stop. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Please, baby, I am begging you. You will figure it out. You always figure it out. Save me." I looked down at her. I did not pull my dress away. I just stared at the pathetic, trembling woman weeping at my feet. "You always were a spectacular actress, Vivian," I said, my voice dangerously quiet, forcing her to stop crying and listen. "You played the perfect wife, the perfect socialite, the perfect mother. But we both know the tax fraud was only half the reason you packed up the house in the middle of the night. Marcus ran from the Internal Revenue Service, but you ran from me." Vivian froze. The fake sobbing stopped instantly. Her eyes widened and a new raw kind of terror washed over her face. She knew exactly what I was about to say. I leaned down, bringing my face inches from hers, so she could not escape my gaze. "Did you really think I forgot what happened 3 days before you left me?" I whispered the words, hitting her like physical blows. "Did you think a 15-year-old girl was too stupid to understand what she saw when she walked into the study and caught you with the treasurer of the regional charity board?" Vivian gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The society women standing a few feet away gasped with her leaning in to hear the final devastating secret. "Marcus was a tax cheat, but you were a thief of a much lower caliber." I continued, my voice steady and lethal. "You were sleeping with the charity treasurer and using his access to embezzle hundreds of thousands of dollars from the Minority Scholarship Fund." You used money meant for underprivileged black students to buy your designer bags and fund your luxury vacations. And I found the ledgers. I saw the bank transfers you hid in the bottom drawer of your desk. I saw you with him. No, Vivian whimpered, shaking her head frantically. No, please do not say it. Do not say it aloud. You did not leave me behind because Marcus put the company in my name, I stated, locking my eyes onto hers and watching her soul shatter. You convinced him to leave me behind because I was the only witness to your crimes. I was the only one who knew that the great Vivian Sterling was a cheap thief and an adulterer. You knew Marcus would divorce you and cut you out of whatever money he had left if he found out. So you silenced me in the most brutal way possible. You abandoned a 15-year-old girl in a house with no electricity to protect your country club membership and your fake marriage. Vivian let out a guttural, devastating wail and collapsed completely onto the floor, burying her face in her hands. The final layer of her lies had been stripped away. She had nothing left to hide behind. She was exposed to the entire world, not just as an accomplice to her husband, but as a deeply corrupt traitor to her own community. The very scholarship funds being celebrated at this gala tonight were the same type of funds she had stolen a decade ago to fund her vanity. I stood up straight, looking down at the broken, weeping woman on the floor. I felt no pity. I felt absolutely nothing but the cold, clean air of total liberation. Suddenly, the massive oak doors at the main entrance of the grand ballroom were kicked open with a thunderous crash that shook the walls. The crowd shrieked and parted violently as a squad of federal agents surged into the room. They wore dark tactical jackets emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the FBI and the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. They moved with swift, terrifying precision, their heavy boots thudding against the marble floors, completely shattering whatever illusion of high society remained in the room. The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom slammed against the walls with a deafening crack that shattered the remaining tension in the room. A dozen federal agents wearing dark tactical vests, stamped with the bright yellow letters of the FBI and the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, swarmed into the opulent space. The sheer physical presence of federal law enforcement completely obliterated the rarefied atmosphere of the Four Seasons Hotel. The elite crowd of judges, politicians, and university board members scrambled backward, creating a massive empty circle in the center of the polished wooden dance floor. In the high society circles of Atlanta, reputation was everything, and nobody wanted to be standing anywhere near the blast radius of a federal indictment. Marcus Sterling froze. The furious adrenaline that had propelled him toward the stage just moments ago evaporated entirely, leaving behind a hollow, terrified shell of a man. Two heavily armed federal agents bypassed the trembling waiters and marched directly toward him with lethal purpose. Marcus tried to step backward, his eyes darting wildly around the room, searching for Charles Vance, his high-priced corporate litigator. But Charles was already near the emergency exit, furiously typing on his mobile phone, actively abandoning his client to avoid being implicated in the sprawling criminal conspiracy. Marcus put his hands up, palms facing outward, attempting to project the dignified authority he had faked his entire life. He demanded to know the meaning of this intrusion, claiming he was a respected businessman and a pillar of the community. The lead agent did not even blink. He grabbed Marcus by the shoulder, spun him around, and slammed his wrists together behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs echoing across the silent ballroom was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The agent read the warrant loudly and clearly, stating that Marcus Sterling was being placed under federal arrest for multi-million-dollar tax evasion, interstate wire fraud, and international money laundering. Marcus struggled, his face pressing against the floor as his tailored suit jacket tore at the shoulder, but the agents held him down with effortless, brutal efficiency. The patriarch who had spent his life stepping on others was finally pinned to the ground by the full weight of the United States government. On the other side of the room, Bryce tried to run. The arrogant tech founder who had spent the entire evening putting black women in their place decided his best strategy was to slip through the panicked crowd and disappear into the night. He made it exactly 10 feet before a massive federal agent intercepted him. Bryce slammed into the agent, bouncing off the tactical vest and stumbling backward onto the carpet. He threw his hands in the air, instantly crying real pathetic tears. He blubbered that he was just a hard-working entrepreneur, that he had been manipulated by his wife's family, that the missing pension funds were just a massive accounting error. Another agent grabbed him, shoving him against a structural pillar and pulling his arms behind his back. The agent read his rights, declaring Bryce under arrest for corporate embezzlement, securities fraud, and grand larceny. Bryce sobbed openly, begging the surrounding venture capitalists to vouch for his character. But the investors he had tried to impress simply turned their backs in disgust. He was dragged away whimpering like a terrified child stripped of all his unearned privilege. Jasmine sat on the floor watching her husband get hauled away in handcuffs. The massive diamond ring on her finger caught the harsh flashing lights of the police cruisers outside. She did not try to help Bryce. She did not reach out for our parents. She just sat there shivering in her ruined designer gown, realizing that her entire identity was gone. There was no wealth, there was no prestige. There was only the crushing reality that she was about to face the world as the broke, unemployed wife of a convicted felon. She wrapped her arms around her knees, rocking back and forth, completely broken by the collapse of her superficial empire. Then the agents moved toward Vivian. She was still kneeling on the floor where she had collapsed after I exposed her affair and her embezzlement of the minority charity funds. When the female federal agent grabbed her arm, pulling her upward, Vivian snapped. The initial shock wore off, and pure narcissistic survival instinct kicked in. She thrashed wildly, kicking her expensive heels against the agent's shins, screaming that she was a victim of a massive misunderstanding. She demanded that the legacy sorority sisters sitting in the front row intervene on her behalf. She shouted that she was a prominent donor, that she knew the mayor, that they could not treat a woman of her high social status like a common street criminal. The agent ignored her frantic protests, simply pinning Vivian's arms behind her back and locking the cold steel cuffs securely around her wrists. The physical reality of the handcuffs finally broke through Vivian's absolute delusion. She stopped fighting the federal agent, and her wild, panicked eyes darted across the room until they locked onto me. I was standing at the edge of the stage, looking down at the entire scene. My posture was perfectly straight, my expression completely unreadable. I watched the scene unfold with the detached clinical observation of a venture capitalist, watching a toxic asset finally get liquidated. I did not feel a single ounce of sorrow. I did not feel the lingering trauma of the abandoned teenager. I just felt an icy, towering sense of absolute power. Vivian stumbled forward, dragging the federal agent with her for a few steps. She looked up at the stage, her face a ruined mess of smeared makeup and sheer, unadulterated terror. "Kiara," she screamed, her voice tearing through her throat, raw and desperate. "Kiara, you have to stop them. Tell them it is a mistake. I am your mother. I gave birth to you." I did not move a single muscle. I stood bathed in the bright white light of the stage spotlight, looking down at the woman who had spent 12 years pretending I was dead. "You have money!" Kiara, Vivian shrieked, falling to her knees again, pulling tightly against the agent's unrelenting grip. "You have the investment fund. You are a billionaire. You can hire the best defense lawyers in the state of Georgia. You can pay the bail money. They are going to lock me in a federal cage, Kiara. Please, you have to write the check. I am your flesh and blood. You cannot just stand there and watch them take your own mother away. I will do whatever you want. I will apologize publicly. I will sign anything you put in front of me. Just bail me out." Her begging was a grotesque, pathetic spectacle. This was the same woman who had sat in my boardroom 2 days ago, demanding $3 million and threatening to destroy my entire firm. This was the same woman who had spent the entire week spreading vicious rumors about me at her exclusive country club luncheons. She had tried to burn me at the stake, and now that the fire had caught her own dress, she was begging me for a bucket of water. The federal agents tugged on her arms, forcing her to stand back up. Marcus was already being marched toward the main exit, his head hung low in absolute public defeat. Bryce was weeping loudly as they escorted him out the side doors. The grand ballroom, once a sanctuary of black excellence and high society, was now a literal crime scene. The hundreds of guests watched in stunned silence as the Sterling family empire was systematically dismantled and dragged out in chains. Vivian dug the heels of her shoes into the carpet, refusing to walk toward the exit. She kept her eyes fixed on me, her chest heaving with desperate, ragged breaths. Kiara, please! She wailed, her voice echoing off the high gilded ceilings, pleading with the daughter she had thrown away. You are the only one who can fix this. You always figure out a way. Save me. You have to save me. If someone were observing this moment from a distance, they would see the entire power dynamic of my life completely inverted. The perspective would pull back, capturing the wide, devastating scope of the massive ballroom. It would show the glittering crystal chandeliers, the terrified high society guests pressing themselves against the walls, the federal agents securing the perimeter, and the pathetic broken criminals wearing handcuffs. And right in the center, elevated above the chaos, standing in the harsh spotlight, ruling over the ashes of the Sterling family would be me. I looked down at the sobbing, hyperventilating woman who had abandoned me in a dark house with no electricity. I listened to her demand my money, my resources, and my protection, as if her biological title erased decades of abuse. I slowly crossed my arms over my chest, locking my hands over the fabric of my emerald green gown. My eyes were ice cold, devoid of a single drop of empathy or hesitation. I looked at Vivian Sterling not as a daughter looking at a mother, but as an executioner looking at the guilty. My answer had been predetermined 12 years ago. I stood perfectly still, letting the deafening silence of the grand ballroom amplify the weight of the moment. The flashing blue and red lights from the federal vehicles outside continued to paint the walls, creating a rhythmic strobe effect across Vivian's terrified face. She was looking up at me with wild, pleading eyes, gasping for air as the federal agent held her firmly in place. She truly believed that blood was a binding contract, that she could invoke the title of mother and wipe away a decade of treachery. I tilted my head, looking down at her, not with anger, but with the absolute clinical detachment of a woman who had already mourned her mother 12 years ago. The woman kneeling before me in a ruined designer gown was just a stranger caught in her own trap. "Bail you out?" I asked, my voice cutting through the heavy air with crystalline clarity. The microphone clipped to my dress carried every single syllable across the expansive room, ensuring that every judge, politician, and socialite heard my final verdict. Vivian nodded frantically, tears spilling over her eyelashes. "Yes, Kiara, please, just write the check. You have millions, you can save me." I let out a slow, measured breath. I looked at the massive digital screen behind me, where the image of the yellow sticky notes still burned bright and undeniably clear. Then I brought my gaze back down to Vivian. "I am afraid I cannot help with that," I said, my tone perfectly conversational. Vivian stopped breathing. Her eyes widened into massive white circles of pure horror as the realization hit her. The umbilical cord she was desperately trying to reattach had just been severed permanently. "But do not worry, Mom," I continued, letting a soft, dangerous smile touch the corners of my mouth. "You will figure it out." The execution was flawless. Those 5 words echoed through the crystal chandeliers, bouncing off the gilded walls and settling directly into the bones of every single person in the room. You will figure it out. The very curse they had placed upon a frightened 15-year-old girl had just been handed back to them, carrying the full weight of a federal indictment. Vivian let out a sound that I can only describe as a dying gasp. Her legs gave out completely. If the federal agent had not been holding her arms behind her back, she would have face-planted directly onto the polished wooden dance floor. She hung there, suspended by the agent's grip, weeping with a visceral, chest-heaving despair that signaled the total, absolute end of her life as she knew it. Marcus, who had been watching this final exchange from a few feet away, finally broke. The last remaining fragment of his arrogant, patriarchal pride snapped cleanly in half. He did not just stumble. He collapsed. The man who had stormed into my office demanding $3 million simply folded in on himself, dropping heavily to his knees before slumping sideways onto the carpet. He curled into a fetal position, a broken, disgraced fraud, unable to even look at the elite peers who were now staring at him with undisguised revulsion. He was a king without a kingdom, suffocating under the weight of his own hubris. Across the room, the reality of the situation triggered a violent, explosive reaction from Bryce. As 2 heavily armed agents hauled him toward the exit doors, his panic mutated into pure, unhinged rage. He began thrashing wildly, kicking his expensive leather shoes against the doorframe, screaming at the top of his lungs. You ruined my life, Bryce roared, twisting his neck to glare back at the wreckage of the Sterling family. I am going to prison because of you. You lied to me, Jasmine. You are a broke, pathetic fraud. I curse the day I ever met you. His curses echoed through the corridor, fading only when the heavy oak doors were shoved open and he was dragged out into the humid Atlanta night directly toward the waiting transport vans. And then there was Jasmine, the golden child, the flawless sorority queen who had spent her entire existence defining her worth by the price tags on her clothing and the status of the people around her. She was sitting on the floor right where Bryce had shoved her, but her humiliation was far from over. A female federal agent approached Jasmine holding a clipboard and a specialized evidence bag. The agent did not offer a hand to help my sister up. Instead, she looked down at Jasmine with cold bureaucratic efficiency. Jasmine Sterling, the agent stated flatly. As part of the asset seizure order related to the federal fraud and embezzlement charges against your husband and your parents, I need you to surrender all assets purchased with illicit funds. That includes the jewelry you are currently wearing. Take it off. Jasmine froze, her tear-streaked face looking up at the agent in absolute disbelief. No, she whimpered, her voice cracking. No, please. This is my engagement ring. This is my anniversary necklace. You cannot take this. Take them off now, or I will forcefully remove them, the agent commanded, stepping closer. The hundreds of elite guests, the women Jasmine had spent years trying to impress, stood in a wide circle watching the ultimate degradation of the Sterling family's golden girl, trembling uncontrollably. Jasmine reached up with shaking fingers and unclasped the heavy diamond necklace from her throat. She dropped it into the plastic evidence bag. Then she pulled the diamond earrings from her earlobes. Finally, sobbing so hard, she was choking on her own breath, she slid the massive 3-carat engagement ring off her finger and let it fall into the bag with a pathetic hollow clink. Stripped of her diamonds, sitting barefoot on the floor in a wrinkled dress, Jasmine looked exactly like what she had always been beneath the expensive facade. A hollow, terrified woman with absolutely nothing of her own. She buried her face in her hands, weeping openly in front of the entire Atlanta high society, stripped of her wealth, her husband, her status, and her dignity. I stood on the stage, absorbing the total systemic destruction of the people who had tried to destroy me. They had walked into this gala expecting a coronation. They were leaving in handcuffs and evidence bags. They had demanded a seat at my table, and I had given them the entire floor. I slowly turned away from the wreckage. I did not need to see them being marched out the doors. I did not need to hear the Miranda rights being read or the click of the transport vans locking shut. The battle was over and the victory was absolute. I smoothed the front of my emerald green gown, ensuring every fold draped perfectly. I held my head high, maintaining the pristine, untouchable posture of a woman who had just conquered her darkest demons. I walked down the center steps of the stage, my heels striking the wood with a steady rhythmic cadence. As I approached the crowd of wide-eyed, stunned guests, something incredible happened. They did not whisper, they did not point, they simply parted. The elite society of Atlanta, the powerful judges, the venture capitalists, the politicians, they all physically stepped backward, creating a wide, unobstructed path for me to walk through. They looked at me with a profound mixture of awe and absolute terror. They had just witnessed a masterclass in strategic execution, and they knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that I was not a woman to be tested. I walked directly through the center of the grand ballroom. I did not look back at Vivian crying in the arms of a federal agent. I did not look back at Marcus curled on the floor or Jasmine stripped of her fake royalty. I left them behind in the burning ruins of their own making. They had lit the match 12 years ago, but I had controlled the inferno. I reached the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom and stepped out into the cool, quiet corridor, leaving the chaos behind me. I walked down the long, carpeted hallway of the Four Seasons, leaving the chaos entirely behind me. The heavy oak doors swung shut, sealing away the frantic screams, the flashing police lights, and the complete disintegration of the Sterling family. The profound silence of the corridor wrapped around me like a warm velvet cloak. I did not stop my pace. I did not look back over my shoulder. I simply walked out into the humid Atlanta night, stepped into the back of my waiting town car, and told my driver to take me home. That was exactly 6 months ago. Tonight, the air in Atlanta is crisp and clear. I slide open the heavy glass doors of my penthouse, stepping out onto the expansive wraparound terrace. The cool night wind immediately catches the fabric of my silk robe. I walk slowly toward the edge, resting my hands on the sleek glass railing. Beneath me, the sprawling metropolis stretches out for miles, a breathtaking grid of gold and white lights pulsing with relentless energy. The city traffic hums a distant rhythmic beat that feels like the very heartbeat of the empire I have built. I stand high above it all, looking down at the world, not as a survivor, but as a conqueror. The federal justice system moved with a swift and brutal efficiency that left my former family absolutely no room to breathe. When you build a life entirely on stolen money and fragile lies, the collapse is not a slow decline, it is a catastrophic freefall. Marcus and Vivian faced a federal judge who was entirely immune to their tears, their manufactured outrage, and their pathetic attempts to play the victims. Their high society connections completely evaporated the moment the grand jury handed down the indictments. Without access to their frozen accounts, they could not afford the elite legal defense team they desperately needed. They were assigned public defenders who watched helplessly as the prosecution presented the mountain of undeniable financial evidence I had meticulously compiled. The sentencing was broadcast on local news networks. I watched it from the comfort of my office, sipping my morning coffee. Marcus stood before the judge looking hollowed out, stripped of his tailored suits and his booming false authority. Vivian stood beside him, trembling in a standard-issue jumpsuit, her signature pearls replaced by steel cuffs. The judge showed zero leniency for their decades of tax evasion, money laundering, and wire fraud. They were both handed 10-year sentences in a federal penitentiary with no possibility of early parole. Their sprawling Maryland estate was seized and auctioned off by the government to pay back a fraction of what they owed the Internal Revenue Service. Bryce tried his absolute hardest to save himself. The arrogant tech founder immediately turned on his in-laws, offering to testify against Marcus and Vivian in a desperate bid for a plea deal. But his own crimes were entirely separate and equally documented. The federal prosecutors did not need his testimony. They already had the bank routing numbers proving he had embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars from his own employees' pension funds. Bryce wept openly in the courtroom when the gavel came down. He was sentenced to 5 years in a minimum security federal prison. A devastating reality check for a man who believed his white privilege and his slick business pitches would always provide an escape route. And then there was Jasmine. My older sister did not face any criminal charges. She had been kept entirely in the dark about the tax fraud and the embezzlement, serving only as the beautiful, clueless face of their fraudulent dynasty. But her punishment was perhaps the most poetic justice of all. When the federal government seized Bryce's assets and liquidated the Sterling family accounts, Jasmine was left with absolutely nothing. Her credit cards were declined. Her luxury leased vehicles were repossessed in the middle of the night. The country club formally revoked her membership, citing the morality clause in their bylaws. She was evicted from her sprawling suburban home and forced to move into a tiny, cramped apartment on the outskirts of the city. To survive and to pay off the massive mountain of personal debt she had accumulated while trying to maintain her high society illusion, Jasmine had to do something she had never done in her entire 29 years of life. She had to get a minimum wage job. I recently received a message from a former sorority sister of hers. It contained a photograph discreetly at a local discount grocery store. There, standing behind the cash register, wearing an ill-fitting polyester uniform and a plastic name tag, was Jasmine. She was scanning canned goods and bagging groceries for the very same women she used to mock at her elite charity luncheons. She spends her days standing on her feet, enduring the pitying stares of former friends who now pretend they do not even recognize her. She has no wealth. She has no status. She has no powerful husband to hide behind. For the first time in her life, Jasmine has to actually figure it out completely on her own. I take a deep breath of the cool night air, letting the absolute finality of it all wash over me. People often assume that revenge is a fiery, chaotic emotion. They think it requires screaming matches, public confrontations, and a heart full of burning hatred. But standing here looking out over the glittering Atlanta skyline, I realize that the truest form of vengeance is actually profoundly quiet. I do not hate Marcus or Vivian. I do not harbor any lingering bitterness toward Jasmine or Bryce. Hate requires energy. Hate requires you to hold on to the people who hurt you, tying your emotional state to their existence. I feel absolutely nothing for them. They are strangers who simply failed to recognize the strength of the person they tried to destroy. I think back to that 15-year-old girl. The girl who woke up in a freezing dark house clutching a cruel yellow sticky note, terrified that her life was over before it even began. For years I carried her trauma like a heavy chain, believing that their abandonment was a reflection of my own worth. I thought I was discarded because I was not enough. But I understand the truth now. They did not leave me because I was weak. They left me because I was the only one strong enough to survive the wreckage they created. I look up at the vast, endless sky above the city. Vanguard Horizon is thriving. My investment portfolio is expanding across the globe, funding brilliant minority founders who are changing the world. I am surrounded by a chosen family of loyal friends, brilliant colleagues and partners who value my mind and respect my boundaries. I have built a fortress of wealth and security that can never be compromised by anyone's greed. The sweetest revenge was not watching my parents get led away in handcuffs or seeing my sister bag groceries. The ultimate victory was the quiet, breathtaking realization that I never actually needed them to shine. Their absence was not a tragedy. It was the catalyst for my entire empire. They left me in the ashes, expecting me to burn. They thought the weight of their debt and the cruelty of their abandonment would crush me into dust. But they forgot one fundamental, undeniable rule of nature. Diamonds are created under the most brutal, unforgiving pressure. I did not just figure it out.